So they think they own our land, they think they own our water, they think they own our children, our education, our money. They completely control all the money supply, think that we have to pay for all their disorderly conduct and their corruption. And the truth of the matter is that none of these things are under federal control.
Legislation that puts teeth into the 10th Amendment resolution in the state of Oklahoma is known as the Federal Tax Escrow Account.
The Federal Tax Escrow Account really has two parts to it. It has first the aspect of it in which it is directing certain federal taxes to be paid to and through the state treasury, and then the state will pass that federal tax on to the federal government, the IRS will say. And let's say it's the federal income tax. People start paying their federal income tax to the state treasury instead of the IRS, and then the state treasury will then pass it on to the federal government. So one of the proposals, and one of the proposals that we have here in Oklahoma and some other states have, is to try to get control over that ability that they have to print money, give it out, and then take it back or hold it back. So putting teeth in the 10th Amendment and in the Constitution, one of those solutions is to require those federal funds in the form of taxes, some of them or all of them, to be paid through the state into the state treasury, and then the state treasury will pass it on to the federal government, unless from time to time we determine that the federal government has committed unconstitutional acts, either directly through the use of that federal tax or in other ways. And then we can hold that money back as a protection for the citizen, and the state.
Well, the theory is to challenge the Commerce Clause power of Congress with the 10th Amendment spin. What the bill says, is now the law in Montana, is that any firearms, ammunition, and firearms accessories made and retained in Montana are simply not subject to any federal jurisdiction under the power of Congress to regulate commerce among the states.
In addition to the Federal Tax Escrow Account, bills are popping up that put a freeze on federal taxes and pay them to the IRS based upon federal compliance to state resolutions and state legislation. These are peaceful and viable solutions to federal abuses.
The bill that I'm working on right now, and I've actually got a meeting with a member of the House Judiciary Committee next week, planned to actually look at this legislation and try to make it consistent with Kansas statute, will take federal tax receipts that are gathered on individuals in the state of Kansas and on corporations that do business in the state of Kansas, would, instead of sending those directly to the IRS, would instead send them to the Kansas Department of Revenue. What they would look at is the proportion of federal spending that satisfies enumerated powers and what percentage does not. Whatever percentage does not satisfy enumerated powers, the state of Kansas will utilize to satisfy unfunded mandates on the part of the federal government. Whatever's left over goes back to the people of Kansas.
We have the ability to tell the federal government to get out, so it's just a lot easier once you inform your state as to what the 10th Amendment is, 9th and 10th Amendment is, and how they can say no to the federal government. Once you talk to your representatives about that, once they get educated, then they start to go, okay, there is a solution to this problem. We can do this all by ourselves as an individual state.
HJR 88 literally enumerates many of the infractions that have been made by the federal government and basically says that from the time of its enacting, from the time that our Missouri State Constitution would be amended as a result of the passage and then voter approval of House Joint Resolution 88, that the state of Missouri would never again be compelled to adhere to or even recognize any law that comes from the federal government that is not constitutional.
It is a message that I hope that the General Assembly in Missouri sends to its federal delegation in Washington, D.C., saying as the elected representatives at the state level, the people that are your constituents also, that you understand, we are sending a message for you to cease and desist.
You also have a direct infringement into state sovereignty when you start talking about our monetary policy. It was left to the Congress to be able to coin money And you know, they delegated that responsibility out to a group of private bankers. And you know, we see that in Article 1, Section 10, that the states are required to only accept gold and silver as legal tender. Well, when you've delegated the authority out to print money by a federal entity, well, actually, it's not even a federal entity, a private entity doing so under the auspices of a federal entity, what you've done is you've infringed, you've basically made criminal organizations out of the states because they can't conduct their transactions in the gold and silver that they're required to under Article 1, Section 10.
In addition to state resolutions that put a freeze on federal taxes, comes an electronic gold system that would increase the gold tax base.
Well, the money bill I originally drafted was for New Hampshire, and it was based on the use of electronic gold currency, mainly because that's the cutting edge technology now. But you could, at the present time, make it gold and silver because they've expanded that technology. But what essentially did was to have the state adopt as an alternative currency this electronic gold system. And in that particular case, it was to a relatively small percentage of the state's budget because we tied it to the tobacco tax, make it simple and not scare people too much. We're not going to jump into the lake with both feet. We're just going to put our toes in, as it were. About 10% of the state's budget would come in gold, and then the state would offer to pay out gold to whichever its creditors, to whomever it owed money, first come, first served. We'll pay that debt in gold. Now, the thought was, I think it's fair, that pretty soon that 10% of the state's revenue in gold would be out the door. People would be lining up to get that. Then the treasurer would come back to the legislature and say, you know what happened here? Our gold stock went to zero in the matter of a month. I need to have more of the tax base turned into gold, increase the gold tax base. And if it's correct that good money will eventually prevail over bad money, you would see most of that state economy, the state spending, would be on a gold basis. And then in the private economy, well, people are receiving gold from the state and people are having to pay gold into the state for taxes. What about in the middle here? Well, now I'm going to start asking people to pay me in gold, or I'm going to start offering to pay the gold that I've received to people. And it would expand through the private economy. And the next thing you know, that state, for all intents and purposes, would be off the Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve notes would be like a foreign currency, like euros or something. Right? You'd only take them when you needed to deal with somebody out of that state that demanded to be paid in Federal Reserve notes. And the other state, people in other states would be looking at it and say, hey, why aren't we dealing in gold?